Hi, it's me. Okay, more. Let's just get going. Let me close Facebook up here. Okay, we're on 6.2, Roman numeral 1. Go down here on page 69 at the bottom, just right after we left off in the previous video. Okay, key concept. The migration that accompanied industrialization transformed both urban and rural areas of the United States and caused dramatic social and cultural changes. So remember, I always call this like the period of the izations: industrialization, urbanization, um, but I said urbanization and then migration, right? And they all, it's like they all feed into each other and fuel each other. I'll just go. Roman numeral 1. International and internal migration increased urban populations and fostered the growth of a new urban culture. So, I mean, I've talked now about migration, I mean, a lot. You should all know the pizza bagels and the Chinese, so I'm not going to go over it all that much. So these are the new immigrants, right? So the cities became areas of economic growth featuring new factories and businesses, industrialization. They attracted immigrants from Asia, China, after the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japan, from Southern and Eastern Europe, hello new immigrants, pizza bagels, as well as African American migrants within and out of the South. Okay, so I know that they put that in here. There's really just not a ton of African American migrants until, I mean, really like World War I, but there are some. There is a trickle starting to come north. And then it says many migrants moved to escape poverty. Yeah, just everywhere. Religious persecution, especially the pogroms in Eastern Europe against the Jews, and limited opportunities for social mobility in their home countries or regions. I mean, that's just universally true of all of these people. Maybe not so much the Italians, because they're coming from a culture in which they are, you know, Italians in Italy, but certainly for African Americans, Eastern Europeans, again, especially like Jews. Yeah. Okay, so we're not going to beat a dead Italian horse to death. So let's move on to B. Urban neighborhoods based on particular ethnicities, races, and classes provided new cultural opportunities for city dwellers. New cultural opportunities, is that a euphemism for tenements, maybe? But I mean, we see that, right, when you go into New York City today. Chinatown, Little Italy, I mean, those are probably the two you're more familiar with. But then for other ethnicities, I remember we looked at the map one time. There's Little Belarus and Little Russia and Little Hungary, right? All these, like, I always use the term ethnic enclaves, but little like local neighborhoods where people tend to have like grocery stores that cater to their culinary needs and desires, and often like newspapers that are in their native languages, people who speak their native language. You get these areas. But then it also mentions classes, right? So like the Lower East Side is definitely the poor working classes, where the upper East Side is the rich. That's where your Rockefellers are going to live, your Vanderbilts. And the Upper West Side is more like often your middle class. Even today, you know, at least those two. And the Lower East Side is now like trendy. Everybody wants to live down there. But certainly the Upper East and West Sides have kind of stayed the same, you know. Okay, move on. C. Increasing public debates over assimilation and Americanization accompanied the growth of internal migration. We did a worksheet on this earlier in the year. It had, because we defined the words assimilate and Americanize. So Americanize is your culture, and assimilate are things like your clothing and speaking, like the language you speak every day. For those of you who went to the tenements, right, they talked a lot about that. Internal migration. You know, so, I mean, you know, Jews who leave Eastern Europe abandon often their headscarves, like for women, even like the Italians often wear like the little headscarf and start dressing in a more like New York and metropolitan fashion. And then it says many immigrants negotiated compromises between the cultures they brought and the cultures they found in the United States. I want to say in Judaism, like that would be like the Reform movement. Not sure on that. Ask your friends. But I think that's what that is. Okay, move on to D. Let's make sure I move on. An urban atmosphere where the access to power was unequally distributed, political machines thrived in part by providing immigrants and the poor with social services. So Tammany Hall, right, the political machine we learned about, they do provide social services. If you need a job, if you're hungry, if you need a variety of different things, help with the police, Tammany would, help you out with the expectation that not only you would vote for them, but then you would talk to, tell your friends what they did and get your friends to vote for them. And so at least in New York City, I don't know why it took me this long to realize I should just make this bigger for you guys, so you can see it a little bit better. Move my screen a bit. Tammany Hall, especially like in New York City, services these immigrant communities. Okay, we're there. Okay. I mean, and they get something for themselves. They get votes. So yeah. Okay, good. Okay, move on to E. Corporations need for. Actually, sorry. No, I'm gonna go back up here. Think about like Jurgis, if you read The Jungle, right? He goes to political machine and does a lot for them, and in turn, they make sure he has a job until he kind of undercuts them in the labor strike, and they kind of kick him out. Okay, on to E. Corporations need for managers and for male and female clerical workers as well increased access to educational institutions. For women, that would be mainly like clerical colleges. Foster the growth of a distinctive middle class. A growing amount of leisure time also helped to expand consumer culture. And so for leisure time, I'd point you to things like Central Park. I think we talked about that earlier in the year. Things like sports like baseball are kind of emerging as cultural phenomenons. But Central Park had, baseball fields and places where people could go for a walk. This is all like a leisure time that middle class people would now have. Managers of corporations, accountants, like clerical workers would all be considered like your like middle class, emerging middle class. Yeah, and helping consumer culture. Now you have disposable income. You go shopping in like these new department stores. Yeah. Okay, let's move on because we're at the halfway mark. Oh, see, now you can't see all of it. Okay, let me shrink it. Do I have to shrink it up? Just move it over. Ta-da! There we go. Okay, key concept 6.2, the migration that accompanied, oh, we read that already. Okay, sorry. Number 2. Large numbers of migrants moved into the West in search of land and economic opportunity, frequently provoking competition and violent conflict. Okay, so westward migration still ongoing. So A, the building of transcontinental railroads, the discovery of mineral resources, we already talked about these things, and government policies promoted economic growth and created new communities and centers of commercial activity. So in the West, you'd have like the buildup of these like boom towns, sometimes overnight towns that were there to service, especially when maybe a railroad was running through. You also have like cattle towns like Abilene, where cattle drives would feed into the big trunk lines that ran east-west in the country, and so you'd drive your cattle there and sell them to market. So there you'd have bars, prostitutes, like horseshoers and all kinds of different industries, places to buy clothing, that would spring up in these towns in the West. Yeah, that's kind of everything for A. Let's move on to B. In hopes of achieving ideals of self-sufficiency and independence, migrants moved to both rural and boomtown areas, there's that word I said, the West for opportunities such as building of railroads, mining, farming, and ranching. You actually find like not big, but significant Italian populations in places like Minnesota where there was a lot of mining, and sometimes if you get like one Italian in there, he would, write other people, other Italians, that he knew families of, and you'd find like these weird places in Minnesota where it's like a bunch of Scandinavian people and then like one town of like lots of Italians. But yeah, so some, don't always think of like every Italian always moves to New York City, right? Some do move to rural areas, especially these boom towns. The thing with a boom town is there's often becomes a bus town, and so some of these dry up and people disperse and move out of there. I mean, probably another significant migrant group I'd mention then for that would be like the Chinese that build, that move in especially to like railroading boom towns because they're responsible largely for building the Central Pacific that starts on the west coast and builds east towards Promontory Point. And actually African Americans, this group of like exodusters, they leave the South after the war, tends to be more semi-skilled and skilled laborers that had experience in sometimes like blacksmithing or animal like husbandry, which means management. So sometimes they'd move out west for farming, especially ranching. There's like a statistic that 2/3 of American like cowboys were actually African American, and like 1/3 were Hispanic, and only 2/3 were like the John Wayne kind of ideal of this like white cowboy. Let's move on. C. As migrant populations increased in numbers and the American bison population was decimated, American bison almost hunted to extinction for mainly sport. Competition for land and resources in the West among white settlers, American Indians, and Mexican Americans led to increased violent conflict. So there you have like the period in the West. Sometimes there's lots of conflict, especially with Native Americans that we talked about. I'm trying to remember if we watched Bury My Heart of Wounded Knee this year. I don't think we did. But we did talk about, oh yeah, because we talked about the Carlisle School, right? So, so with Native Americans, you have things like the Sioux Wars that happen out in the Sioux reservations, and then you have this reservation system that was started by Jackson, not necessarily by Jackson, but started around Jackson, becomes a concentration period where you're pushing Native Americans on smaller and smaller and smaller reservations to give it to white settlers. And then you have, for example, Custer's Last Stand, where Native Americans win some autonomy, mainly the Sioux win some autonomy for a while, but then you have the Ghost Dance, which ends up leading into the Battle of Wounded Knee and the massacre of the Sioux, which kind of kills the Indian resistance. I'm going to save the rest of what I was going to say because I'm looking down at D and I think it relates to that. So let's see. The American government violated treaties with American Indians and responded with resistance to military force. Custer's Last Stand, Wounded Knee, eventually confining American Indians to reservations and denying them tribal sovereignty. So that is the Dawes Severalty Act, to sever them from the tribes. Oh no, sorry, that's down one more. But we talked about like the reservation and then the concentration, moving them into smaller and smaller reservations, like concentrating them down into small areas. Okay, sorry, let's go down to E. Many American Indians preserve their culture and tribal identities despite government policies promoting assimilation. So that's the Dawes Severity Act. If you would sever your ties with your tribe, you could get, I think it was 150 acres of land, but for you, not tribal land ownership. And what it does, it undercuts the power of a lot of the tribes. Also for assimilation, we spent that entire day looking at the Carlisle School in now Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where the Native Americans had to cut their hair and couldn't speak in their native languages, had to take Christian names and practice Christianity. So, I mean, that is assimilation. So we're trying to assimilate immigrants, we're trying to assimilate Native Americans. And then it goes on to say, and they attempt to develop self-sustaining economic practices. Okay, so just know that. How long is this one? I only have a minute left. Okay, I'm going to end this one and pick up anew.